Azra, dzień dobry, or whatever you say in in Belgrade. I am thinking in Polish because Kat's birthday is today, and I know she is Czech, but she also speaks very good Polish. So it is a model of languages in my head at the moment. So I shall do what all English people do and speak in English. Because we do not speak other languages very well. I hope you're waking up okay, and I am just going to continue where we left to the lighthouse. I did want to read, I told you about this, a comparable chapter from the book that I read for Rika yesterday, about the psychology and method of Virginia Woolf. But let's leave that for another day. I think it will be really interesting. But of course, the important thing is Virginia's own words, and I shall try to read them now, although I am very dopey, and I might make several mistakes. I apologize if I do. And we had left the Ramsay family and their guests wondering about getting to the lighthouse and all the tension and uncertainty that was associated with the wait for this special trip. I'm continuing now from page 11 of my edition, still from the section The Window. "There'll be no landing at the lighthouse tomorrow," said Charles Tansley, clapping his hands together, as he stood at the window with her husband. Surely he had said enough. She wished they would both leave her and James alone and go on talking. She looked at him. He was such a miserable specimen, the children said, all humps and hollows. He couldn't play cricket. He poked, he shuffled. He was a sarcastic brute, Andrew said. They knew what he liked best. To be forever walking up and down with Mr. Ramsay, and saying who had won this, who had won that, who was a first-rate man at Latin verses, who was brilliant but I think fundamentally unsound, who was undoubtedly the ablest fellow in Balliol, who had buried his light temporarily at Bristol or Bedford, but was bound to be heard of again when his prolegomena, of which Mr. Tansley had the first pages in proof with him, if Mr. Ramsay would like to see them, to some branch of mathematics or philosophy saw the light of day. That was what they talked about. She could not help laughing sometimes. She said the other day something about waves mountains high. "Yes," said Charles Tansley, "it was a little rough." "Aren't you drenched to the skin?" she had said. "Damp! Not wet through," said Mr. Tansley, pinching his sleeve, feeling his socks. But it was not that they minded, the children said. It was not his face, it was not his manners. It was him, his point of view. When they talked about something interesting, people, music, history, anything, even said it was a fine evening, so why not sit out of doors? Then what they complained of about Charles Tansley was that he had turned the whole thing round, and made it somehow reflect himself and disparage them, put them all on edge somehow, with his acid way of peeling the flesh and blood off everything. He was not satisfied, and he would like to go, and he would go to picture galleries, they said, and he would not ask one, did one like his tie? God knows, said Rose, one did not. Disappearing as stealthily as stags from the dinner table directly the meal was over, the 8 sons and daughters of Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay sought their bedrooms, their fastnesses in a house where there was no other privacy, to debate anything, everything. Tansley's tie, the passing of the Reform Bill, seabirds and butterflies, people, while the sun poured into these attics, which a plank alone separated from each other, so that every footstep could be plainly heard, and the Swiss girl sobbing for her father, who was dying of cancer in a valley of the Grisons, and lit-up bats, flannels, straw hats, ink-pots, paint-pots, beetles, and the skulls of small birds, while it drew from the long-frilled strips of seaweed, pinned to the wall, a smell of salt and weeds, which was in the towels too, gritty with sand from bathing. Strife, divisions, difference of opinion, prejudices twisted into the very fibre of being. Oh, that they should begin so early, Mrs. Ramsay deplored. They were so critical, her children. They talked such nonsense. She went from the drawing-room, holding James by the hand, since he would not go with the others. It seemed to her such nonsense, inventing differences, when people, heaven knows, were different enough without that. The real differences, she thought, standing by the drawing-room window, are enough, quite enough. She had in mind at the moment rich and poor, high and low, the great in birth receiving from her, half grudging, some respect, for she had not in her veins the blood of that very noble, if slightly mythical, Italian house, whose daughters, scattered about English drawing-rooms in the 19th century, had lisped so charmingly, had stormed so wildly, and all her wit, and all her bearing, and her temper, came from them, and not from the sluggish English, or the cold Scotch. But more profoundly she ruminated the other problem of rich and poor, and the things she saw with her own eyes, weekly, daily, here or in London, when she visited this window, or that struggling wife in person with a bag on her arm, and a notebook and pencil with which she wrote down in columns, carefully ruled for the purpose, wages and spendings, employment and unemployment, in the hope that thus she would cease to be a private woman, whose charity was half a sop to her own indignation, half a relief to her own curiosity, and become what with her untrained mind she greatly admired, an investigator, elucidating the social problem. And if you don't mind, I'll stop there. Yet again, 100 things to say about only one page. It's quite incredible, isn't it? I don't know, Azra. Are you reading this in a Serbian edition? I presume that you're reading this in translation. But does the book that you are reading have what we call footnotes, i.e. explanatory notes in the back to explain about things like the Great Reform Bill or Balliol and things that you could not be expected to know? Because I would be happy to read those notes for you if you have not got good notes, but it would interrupt the flow of the story. Anyway, we can talk about this at some point. Thank you for listening. Have a brilliant day. Bye bye.